Good afternoon. I apologize for being late. We had a lot to do today, and we're making an effort to try to brief the family members about the information that we're releasing prior to briefing the media. This morning I had a chance to meet with our investigators at the accident site and see some of the progress on the work. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that we've completed in the last 24 hours and some of the things that we'll be working on. Our power plants team is finishing up some of their on-scene work right now. They identified that there was a post-crash fire on the inboard section of the number 2 engine. That's the right engine. An oil tank had ruptured and leaked fuel onto the hot engine. They identified that both thrust reversers were stowed and that the engines weigh approximately 15,750 pounds. Our aircraft performance team is working on completing the documentation, particularly this total station or the GPS documentation. They're working on completing the total station or the GPS documentation of the crash site. This includes from the seawall down the runway up to the aircraft. They expect to finish that today. Air Traffic Control Group has been looking at radar data, plots, altitudes, glide slope. They've also requested some additional information from the FAA, from Air Traffic Control. They've requested data for all 777 approaches to 28 left within the last few days. They've also requested that the FAA provide information on all of the go-arounds that have occurred on that same runway since June. They're asking for this information because it provides us with some baseline information and they could identify trends. Our structures and our systems group worked on some documentation of the cockpit. They made the following direct observations with respect to switch positions and information that's specific evidence in the cockpit. They found that the flight director was on for the right seat. It was off for the left seat. The auto throttles were armed. All 3 fire handles were extended, and these would activate bottles to put out fires because the crew is concerned there could be a fire if they have this crash in both engines and the APU. And so they saw that this was extended for all 3 locations. Flaps were set to 30. The speed brake lever was down, which indicates that it was not being used. Our survival factors team yesterday was their first day to go inside the aircraft. They are removing overhead bags and personal effects in the aircraft and working to document things inside the cabin. There are efforts to sift through the burned wreckage in the section of the aircraft that has extensive fire damage. And they're documenting the seating compartment. There are over 300 seats on the aircraft, and our team is working to document them for survivability analysis purposes. We're working to obtain a passenger manifest to understand seating locations for the passengers, and we also want to use this to help identify fatalities and injuries in seating positions, specific seating positions, and the injuries or the lack thereof. They've removed all of the slides from the aircraft. There were 8 doors and 8 slides that were removed. one of the doors, door 4 left, was outside of the aircraft on the ground at the crash site. The other 7 doors are attached to the airframe. While out at the accident site, I had an opportunity to walk the entire debris field from the aircraft to the seawall and back. When you get down to the seawall, you can identify where the first strikes took place. First, the main landing gear impacted the seawall, and then the tail. You can see pieces of the cabin, sections of the cabin, that are found very early on in the debris field. You can see aircraft parts, galley materials, newspapers, magazines, and flooring. We began interviewing the cabin crew today, as well as airport operations, airport rescue and firefighting personnel, and other emergency response personnel. We're looking very closely at the evacuation. We're looking at videos. We're interested, of course, talking to the cabin crew and the flight crew, as well as the surviving passengers to understand what was going on. Many of you have had questions about the evacuation, and so I'm going to give you some basic background on full-scale evacuation requirements. The FAA requires full-scale evacuation of the maximum seating capacity requested for certification of an aircraft. The test has to be conducted using test passengers who are unfamiliar with the aircraft's cabin's arrangement and represent a diverse range of ages and genders. Half of the exits are to be blocked. Only emergency lighting is permitted to simulate darkness. And the aisles and passageways are littered with pillows, blankets, and luggage. The test is considered successful if all of the aircraft's occupants exit within 90 seconds. The manufacturer typically uses a line crew to serve as the flight crew and the cabin crew during this evacuation exercise. Our ops, or our operations and human performance team, has spent the last day and a half interviewing the crew members. When I briefed you yesterday, I had indicated that they were conducting interviews yesterday. The interviews took longer than our team expected. They interviewed 2 of the flight crew members yesterday, and they're interviewing 2 of the flight crew members today. They've completed 3 of the 4 interviews, and the 4th interview is being conducted now. I'm going to talk to you about the 4 flight crew members, and I'm going to share with you some information about their experience as relayed to our investigators during the interviews and some of their observations that they reported to our team. All of the crew members have been very cooperative and very forthright with our team. The interviews took a little bit longer than expected because we wanted to make sure that they were very thorough, and there were translation needs, and so that required a slower pace. The information that the Asiana crew members provided has not been validated by our investigators comparing it to their paper records. And so this is information that's been relayed by the individual pilots. And it could be modified if we review and compare it to paper records. I'm going to provide you a summary of the high points. There were 3 pilots in the cockpit at the time of the crash. There was 1 pilot who was in the back, seated in the cabin during the approach and landing into San Francisco. I'm going to talk to you about the pilots, and I'm going to refer to them as the pilot flying, who was sitting in the left seat, the instructor pilot, who was seated in the right seat, the relief first officer, who was sitting in the jump seat, and the relief captain, who was sitting in the cabin. So first I'm going to talk about the pilot flying, the pilot in the left seat. He reported to our investigators that he had 9,700 hours of total flight time. He had about 5,000 hours as pilot in command. This was his initial operating experience in the 777. To complete initial operating experience for Asiana, he's required to have 20 flights and 60 flight hours. He had 10 legs. He had completed 10 legs and about 35 hours flying the 777. So he was about halfway through his initial operating experience on the 777. He was hired in 1994. He did his initial training in Florida. The flying pilot is rated in the 737, the 747, the A320, and the 777. He was a ground school instructor and a sim instructor for the A320, A321. He was a captain on the A320 from 2005 to 2013. Immediately prior to his initial operating experience on the 777, he was flying as a captain on the A320. The instructor pilot, this is the pilot who is seated in the right seat. He's also a captain. He reported to our investigators that his total flight time is 13,000 hours. He estimated he had about 3,000 hours in the 777. His total pilot in command time was about 10,000 hours. He had been in the Korean Air Force for 10 years. He reported that this was his first trip as an instructor pilot. The instructor pilot stated that he was the pilot in command. He was sitting in the right seat. This was the first time that he and the flying pilot that he was instructing had flown together. The relief first officer, who was sitting in the jump seat, reported to our investigators that he had 4,600 hours flight time. He estimated that he had 900 to 1,000 hours flying the 777. He flew F-5s and F-16s in the Korean Air Force. He had flown to San Francisco 5 or 6 times as the pilot monitoring. The fourth pilot, who was serving as the relief captain, was not in the cockpit for the approach. As I mentioned, he was seated in the cabin, and his interview is currently underway. Here are some observations from the crew members that have been interviewed. And again, this information needs to be corroborated with the cockpit voice recorder and other information. We're reporting to you what the witnesses stated in their interviews. I'm missing some sections. Okay. This information, again, came from the crew interviews. Approach asked them to maintain 180 knots until they were about 5 miles out. This aircraft has a max 160 knots to put down the landing flaps for their final configuration. The crew relayed, again, additional information. The pilot that was sitting in the jump seat, the relief first officer, identified that he could not see the runway or the PAPI from his seating position, and that the aircraft was, the nose was pitched up, and so he couldn't see the runway. The instructor pilot stated that, and this is the best of his recollection in the interview, that they were slightly high when they passed 4,000 feet, that they set vertical speed mode at about 1,500 feet per minute. At about 500 feet, he realized that they were low. He reported seeing 3 red and 1 white on the PAPI. He told the pilot to pull back. They had set speed at 137 knots, and he assumed that the auto throttles were maintaining speed. Between 500 feet and 200 feet, they had a lateral deviation and they were low. They were trying to correct at that point. At 200 feet, he noticed the 4 PAPIs were red. The airspeed was in the hatched area on the speed tape, and he recognized that the auto throttles were not maintaining speed, and he established a go-around attitude. He went to push the throttles forward, but he stated that the other pilot had already pushed the throttles forward. There was a description of the event. And again, this is from the interviews of the crew, that after the impact, the aircraft ballooned, it yawed left, and it went into a 360-degree spin. Of the individuals in the cockpit, the first officer was the one that received medical treatment. He was hospitalized and released. He had a cracked rib. Neither of the other 2 pilots that were in the cockpit were admitted to the hospital. There have been some questions about operations before an air carrier and what the requirements are for air carriers from other countries versus operations in the United States. I want to say we're at the beginning of the investigation. We're gathering information that's perishable. We're doing documentation. We will have an opportunity to look at all of that information down the road. But if you want specific details about what is required, what the regulations are with respect to training in the U.S. versus other countries, I would refer you to the Federal Aviation Administration, who may be able to provide you more detail at this time. Our public affairs staff can provide you contact information after the press conference about how to get in touch with them. Drug and alcohol testing is required for Part 121 carriers. Part 121 carriers are commercial operators based in the United States. Part 129 refers to those commercial operators that are based in foreign countries. Under Part 121 requirements, crews involved in an accident are required to be tested for drugs and alcohol. We made inquiries after our arrival on scene regarding drug and alcohol testing. None of the crew members on Asiana Flight 214 were tested for drugs and alcohol post-crash. We have a number of family members, survivors, who are at our Family Assistance Center. There are efforts to work with them, and as I mentioned, we want to try to brief them before we provide briefings to you all. I appreciate your patience, and thank you for being here today. I'm ready to take questions.
Deborah, would it be fair to say that you're...
Actually, if you could wait to be acknowledged and then identify yourself. Yes, sir.
So it's Jerry Shee with Reuters. I was wondering if you could talk about whether there was an escape chute that was then inflated inside the aircraft. Did it trap passengers or crew? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. We have heard numerous reports and accounts from individuals on the aircraft about slides deploying inside the aircraft. The question was, have slides deployed inside the aircraft? And in fact, when we interviewed the first officer, he did describe, the relief first officer who was in the jump seat, he did describe a chute that had deployed inside and trapped one of the flight attendants, and his efforts to free the flight attendant from that chute where they were trapped. We know from witness statements, from passenger statements, that there were chutes that deployed. I mentioned we've gathered up all 8 of the chutes that came from the door. We're working to understand through interviews with the cabin crew and also accounts from the passengers about which slides inflated inside the aircraft and why. We need to understand whether they were inadvertently deployed, whether it was a function of the crash. That's certainly not what's intended. We need to understand what happened so we can prevent it from occurring in the future. In the back?
Yes, Dan Kerman, Crown 4 News, about the drug and alcohol tests. So just to clarify, are foreign pilots then required to take the drug and alcohol test or not? And if so, who is required to make sure they do that?
The question is, are foreign crews required to be drug and alcohol tested? Yeah. What I can share with you now is the facts that we know it. We're still looking into a lot of this information. What we do know is that U.S. air carrier crews are required, in safety-sensitive positions, are required to be drug and alcohol tested post-accident. For Part 129 or foreign carriers, there is no specific U.S. requirement. They are deferring to the country in which those air carriers are based. The countries where the air carriers are based have oversight over the operator, and they also have oversight over the pilot's licensing. The U.S. does not have oversight responsibilities for Asiana or foreign licensed pilots. What I'm relaying to you is some information that we've identified. We need to look into it a little bit further to understand all the nuances. Yes, sir, in the back.
Mike Lurie, KCRA TV Sacramento. Based on the evidence of what you've uncovered so far, would it be fair to say that you're looking more at a cause of pilot error as opposed to mechanical error?
The question is based on the information that has been provided so far, are we looking at pilot error versus mechanical error? At this point, the NTSB has released a lot of information. This is factual information. It will not change over the course of the investigation. We will not determine probable cause while we are here on scene. That will come after we have collected all of the information and analyzed it. I would really encourage all of you to be very cautious about speculating on the cause of the crash. There is a lot of information that has to be gathered, and we've talked about some of it today, but you can see there's still a lot of work to be done. Yes, sir.
Mark Cooper, CBS News. Is there a difference in the seatbelt restraints from first class, business class to main cabin?
Sure. Hey, Kelly, can you guys close that door? I'm sorry, can you?
I was asking, is there a difference in the seatbelt restraints from people in the first class, business class, as opposed to the main cabin?
The question is there a difference in restraints between the cabins? In this cabin, I believe they have a business class and economy class. business or business/first and economy. We will have to take a look at all of that information. We'll have to look at the specs of the aircraft as delivered by Boeing 2006 to see if there were any modifications made later by Asiana to the interior of the cabin. We mentioned that we're documenting the seats. There was extensive fire damage in the area where that business first class cabin is. I mentioned that while our folks are on scene, their teams, they're working to sift through the fire damage section. It's heavily charred. There's a lot of ash. And so what we're looking for in that case is buckles that might have survived, seatbelt buckles that may have shown whether or not they were latched or not. We don't have a pristine environment to evaluate. There was extensive fire damage in that section of the aircraft.
Can you just tell there's a difference between them?
I don't know. I need to look at the specs for the aircraft as delivered and determine if there were any modifications made by Asiana after delivery. Matt.
Matt Wald, New York Times. Thank you. Did I understand correctly from what you said just now, what you said yesterday? The auto throttles were set by the crew to maintain a speed of 137 knots. Airspeed dropped to 103 knots. So have you actually recovered the auto throttles or just looked at the switches at this point? What's next?
The question is, have we recovered the auto throttles, looked at the switches that the crew had set in their interview? They stated that they had set speed to 137 on the auto throttles. And what's next? We have relayed information about cockpit instruments and positions, and the auto throttles were in the armed position when our crew went into the cockpit to do documentation. We are now going to be looking at flight data recorder information to validate parameters associated with the autopilot and automation, things like the auto throttles. We need to work to understand what the different modes are, what can be selected, and what the crew understood about the modes that they selected.
Does armed mean engaged? If they were engaged?
The question is, does armed mean that they were engaged? Armed means that they are available to be engaged, but depending on what mode is used, we really need to understand that a little bit better to understand how they were used, what the expectation was for the auto throttles. Yes, sir.
Yes, peak on a trio, KNX 1070 Los Angeles. From what you're indicating right now, you say the auto throttles were engaged, but the aircraft continued to lose speed going on there. Is there any kind of a backup sensor or alarm which would have alerted the first officer, pilot, or the instructor pilot, your auto throttle isn't holding speed here and there's an alarm? Is there a backup system of any kind on that?
The question is there a backup system of any kind for the auto throttles with respect to holding speed? We have convened our cockpit voice recorder group in Washington. They're going through the tape. They're listening for any audibles or any sounds. We're also working with the manufacturer, Boeing, and they are providing us in the coming hours and days with information about the systems and how they're designed. And so we really do need to gather a little bit more information and corroborate the data before we understand the issue. But let me be very clear. The crew is required to maintain a safe aircraft. That means that they need to monitor. We have a flying pilot, and we have two other pilots that are in the cockpit, and they have a monitoring function. One of the very critical things that needs to be monitored on an approach to landing is speed. And so we need to understand what was going on in the cockpit and also what was going on with the aircraft. Yes, sir.
I'm Joe Conlon, I'm a flight attendant. I have a question regarding the cabin staff. Is there any information available at this time as to flight attendants being perhaps unconscious or unable to open exits? And was it only one slide, and where was that slide located that fell into the cabin?
I have a couple of questions. The first question is, were any of the flight attendants incapacitated? Is that your question?
Right.
And unable to assist? What I can tell you is that two of the flight attendants in the rear of the aircraft were ejected from the aircraft during the impact sequence, and so they were not at their stations when the aircraft came to rest. They were found down the runway and off to the side of the runway. Those flight attendants survived, but they obviously had gone through a serious event and have injuries. The second question had to do with the deployment of the slides, and I'm assuming you mean the slides that deployed interior to the aircraft. We're still determining how many of the slides deployed inside the aircraft. We have a number of witnesses that describe interior slide deployment. We need to figure out if they're seeing the same slide, if we're talking about different slides. All of that information needs to be documented. We do know there was interior slide deployment. We just need to quantify it and locate the positions. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Martha Mendoza with Associated. Why was the fourth pilot in the rear cabin? Why did other pilots get distracted?
Sure. The question is, why is the fourth pilot in the cabin rather than in the cockpit? In this configuration with 4 pilots, the two crews, and they're 2 paired crews. Remember, we talked about them, and I tried to give them names so it wouldn't be confusing. So we're talking about where they're seated and what they're doing on landing in San Francisco. So we have the flying pilot, who's going through his initial operating experience. We have the instructor pilot, who's the training captain. Those two are paired together. They begin the trip together. They take off. They fly for a few hours. The other 2 crew members, the relief captain that's seated in the cabin, and the relief first officer, relieve them. They come into the cockpit. They fly the aircraft for a few hours while the others get rest and eat. And then about an hour and a half before arrival into San Francisco, the flying pilot and the instructor pilot come back into the cabin for the landing leg. This is information that was relayed to us by the instructor pilot as far as timing in his interview with our investigators. And so it's two-man crews. They're paired, and they take turns flying this trans-Pacific flight. So you've got crew number 1 that takes off, flies for a few hours. You've got crew number 2 that comes in for the cruise portion of the flight, and then crew number 1 comes back in for the landing. There are 2 pilots that are required to be in the cockpit. The third pilot that came in to monitor the landing. There is no requirement for 4 pilots to be in the cockpit. In the back?
Thank you. Steve Gregory, KFI Los Angeles. While we appreciate all the information you've been giving us, the pilots union has been very critical of you being this forthcoming. I just wondered if you had any comment about that.
Sure. The question is, the pilots union, ALPA, has been very critical of the amount of information that the NTSB has been providing since the crash of Asiana 214. I would say that the information that we're providing in this investigation is consistent with our procedures and our processes in accident investigations in all modes of transportation. One of the hallmarks of the NTSB is our transparency. We work for the traveling public. There are a lot of organizations and groups that have advocates. We are the advocate for the traveling public. We believe it's important to show our work and to tell people what we are doing. Alan.
Hi, Alan Levin with Bloomberg News. Can you describe in any greater detail the lateral deviation that I believe it was what one of the pilots described?
Sure. The question is, can I describe in greater detail the lateral deviation that the instructor pilot described in his interview with our team? When he's talking about a lateral deviation, it's the lining up on the center line, the left-right, the guidance that he's talking about there. The instructor captain stated that they were trying to make corrections during that portion of the flight between 500 feet and 200 feet to make some lateral corrections, and also because they knew that they were low on the glide slope, because he saw the indication from the PAPIs. And remember, we've talked in previous briefings about the PAPIs. The PAPIs are Precision Approach Path Indicator lights. These are lights that are set up for the runway, and there are 4 of them. And when you're approaching, if you are high on the glide slope, you will see white lights. If you are low on the glide slope, you will see red lights. If you are on the glide slope, you will see half white, 2 white, and 2 red. If you're a little bit low, you're going to see 3 red. If you're a little bit high, you're going to see 3 white. So I think you understand how this works. You're going from white to red, and the sweet spot is right in the middle with 2 and 2. So they want 2 red and 2 white. And so when he was relaying to us information about what he saw with the PAPIs, he's describing whether they were high on the glide path or low on the glide path. We had conversations about the glide slope previously, and so they were making corrections. So they're making corrections vertically because they knew they were low, and they're making lateral corrections to line up on the center line.
Chairman, can we take one more question?
Yes, ma'am.
Heather Ishimaro, ABC7 News. Some Chinese media are reporting that a surviving passenger sitting across from the fatalities thought one of the girls unbuckled her seatbelt right at landing. Can you comment on that at all?
The question is that a surviving passenger that was interviewed stated that one of the girls that was in a fatal in the crash unbuckled her seatbelt prior to landing. And I don't have any comment to provide on that because we really need to provide some documentation and some evidence. That will mean that we need to look at the seat. This is why we're talking about getting the manifest, knowing where people are seated, and then documenting the seats, documenting the damage to the seat, if the buckles are latched or not, and if there's any damage to the seats. Thank you all very much. We will be back tomorrow to provide additional factual information.